Hey guys, and welcome to Chapter 12, going over marine and coastal ecosystems as well as going over oceans. This is my favorite lecture out of every chapter in the entire book. I'm a marine ecologist by training. I love all of these. We're going to be going over in detail some of my favorite ecosystems, and I cannot wait. I hope you guys are going to be just as excited about this as I am. All right, so going into it, oceans are basically one of the largest ecosystems or one of the largest biomes on the entire planet. They cover 71% of Earth and hold 90% of all surface water. Oceans touch every single ecosystem. They receive inputs, sediments, pollutants, different organisms. They provide most of the water that generates our weather, so they are ultimately the source of a lot of our fresh water, and they are actually the source of a huge majority of the oxygen on the planet. You guys might think that trees are what are photosynthesizing and producing all of the oxygen on the planet. That's actually not true. Phytoplankton, or basically the autotrophic producers at the base of the marine food chain, these guys over here on the right-hand side of your page, they actually produce 50% of all oxygen on the entire planet. There are so many phytoplankton in the ocean, and they produce a ton of oxygen. So we actually rely on these bad boys just for the air we breathe, just as much as we rely on trees. So yes, deforestation is a major issue, but the phytoplankton over here in our world's oceans are actually extremely important. Now, there are multiple different zones within the ocean. There's something called the photic zone, and that is very similar to the limnic zone in our freshwater ecosystems. The photic zone is the warm layer, basically the highest layer or the top layer of the ocean, and that's area where sunlight can penetrate. These are going to also be very well mixed areas. There's going to be a lot of oxygen coming down from the atmosphere. There's also going to have the highest amount of primary productivity. This is where we have all of our phytoplankton, and as a result, the base of the marine food web is in this photic zone. Now, before we get too far into the other zones, I do want to make a note that the continental shelf, which has a large amount of the photic zone, is going to have the highest species diversity of any ecosystem or any place in the entire ocean. This is going to be a quiz question. It's also going to be an exam question, so you definitely need to know that. I'm going to reiterate this again when we go into our coastal ecosystems, but know that continental shelves are where all of the diversity is on the planet, or within the oceans at least. Now, after we go to our photic zone, we then go to our aphotic zone. The aphotic zone is a very large, expansive ocean. It has a very large volume, and it's the lower level of the ocean, which basically is the cold bottom layer below the photic zone, and no light or very little sunlight actually gets to this area. It's very oxygen poor just because there's a lot of separation between this zone and the surface, where water and oxygen can actually intermingle and absorb oxygen into the ocean. And so it's going to be categorized by low productivity, low oxygen, and almost no light. So there's going to be no primary productivity, no autotrophs. Everything down there is going to be a heterotroph, and it's not going to rely on photosynthesis. Now, the different realms within the ocean, there are two of them. The first is the pelagic realm. That is anywhere where the ecosystems are going to be it's going to be where organisms are swimming around at. And then contrast that with the benthic zone. The benthic zone is going to be the ocean floor. So the benthic zone is going to be habitats that are along the physical bottom of the ocean. The pelagic zone is going to be everywhere else where the ecosystems are mainly consisting of water. Now, oceans regulate nutrients and oceans regulate climate. These are going to be two very specific and very important components that are going to be reiterated over and over again in your quiz, and they're going to be reiterated over and over again in your exam. So first, we're going to go through nutrients, and oceans regulate nutrients from two specific ways. Upwelling basically is where the cold, deep water rises to the surface. Basically, oceans are affected by gravity just like any other place on the planet. So what's going to happen is that a lot of nutrients in particular matter are going to gradually settle down from the top of the ocean and gradually accumulate at the bottom of the ocean just because they're falling down through the water as a result of gravity. However, occasionally what's going to happen is surface winds are going to push water from one area, surface water from one area to another area, and as a result there's going to be a low pressure zone right at the base of that surface wind where the water is being moved. So as a result, cold water from the bottom of the ocean is sucked up into the surface water, and when it gets sucked up, it takes all of that rich nutrients into the surface water as well. well. As a result, this can be incredibly lucrative fisheries, and areas where there is very consistent upwelling have very, very biologically productive areas. There's going to be a lot of nutrients, so phytoplankton are exploding, and when phytoplankton explode, everything that eats phytoplankton, so that entire marine food web, is going to be exploding as well. And so these are going to be very diverse, very biologically productive areas. Now, the second part of oceans regulating nutrients is regulating oxygen. Downwelling is something that occurs when the warm oxygen-rich water actually sinks. So in areas where, for example, southerly winds are blowing the surface water over itself, essentially it forces the water down, and this oxygen-rich water then permeates into the lower levels of the photic zone and causes phytoplankton to bloom at the lower levels, enriching productivity in the lower levels of the photic zone, where you might actually not see a lot of productivity otherwise. So the next thing that we need to talk about is how oceans regulate climate, and this can be a little complex. It's hard to understand how oceans can actually regulate things like long-term weather patterns, even on distant terrestrial systems. But it's really important because oceans do have a huge hand in the climates, especially in the northern and southern high latitudes of the planet. So basically, before we go into anything else, we need to go into a little bit of physics. Water is a heat sponge. Basically, what this means is water has high heat capacity, or it takes a huge amount of energy for water to heat up. So unlike metal, which is a has a low heat capacity, it doesn't take a lot of energy to heat metal up to a very high temperature. Water, it takes a ton of energy relative to its mass to heat it up 1 degree Celsius or 1 degree Fahrenheit. Similarly, it gives off a lot of energy, and it takes a long time for water to cool down. So water is very energetically dense. So it takes a lot of time to heat up, it takes a lot of time to cool down, and as a result, when it is mixed with ocean currents, it has a very high capacity to distribute heat across the planet. And this property in and of itself does a fantastic job in regulating Earth's climates. So when we go into, now that we have an idea of what a high heat capacity is, we can move into currents and what is called thermohaline circulation. So it shouldn't really come as a surprise to you that surface water is warmer than subsurface water, and deeper water is dense and very sluggish. So what happens is that these currents form across the entire ocean, and it's basically like a giant convection belt. So basically they form warm water or shallow currents, as well as cold water deep currents that are constantly interacting with one another and circulating all across the globe. Basically, shallow warm water currents bring warm water to polar regions and northern latitudes and keep them a lot warmer than they otherwise would be. One of the key examples here are Great Britain and the UK. Basically, that climate would be very, very cold, actually frigid, borderline uninhabitable, if it weren't for what was called the Gulf Stream. Basically, the Gulf Stream delivers warm water all the way up the North Atlantic or the North American coast, and then it crosses the Atlantic Ocean and delivers warm water continuously to Great Britain and the UK. So this is one example of oceans regulating the climate of a northern island, which would be much, much colder than it otherwise is. Second, the oceans regulate climates by maintaining higher temperatures as well as elevated precipitation levels. So we just talked about how the oceans will maintain higher temperatures in the northern regions, but that warm air is also very moist and very subject to evaporation. And so by doing this, they actually transport higher levels of wet weather to these northern regions. So not only are they going to be a lot warmer, but they're also going to be a lot wetter. And remember from our biomes chapter in chapter 4, when we were talking about how warm weather and a high amount of water in an area basically determine how biologically productive those areas are. So by bringing high amounts of temperature and precipitation to northern latitudes, oceans basically maintain biodiversity at these northern latitudes at levels far higher than they otherwise would be. Now, one specific example of these deep water and shallow water currents interacting with one another is something called the North Atlantic Deep Water Current. And this is just one part of the system. Remember that we talked about how the warm water from the Gulf Stream flows north across the Atlantic Ocean and transmits heat all the way to Great Britain, giving it a much warmer, much wetter climate, so much more lush and highly biologically diverse compared to what it otherwise would be. Then this cold water cools and sinks, and it becomes saltier and more dense and contributes then to the deep water current. Basically, this creates a region of downwelling, so not only is it creating a warmer and more lush terrestrial environment, but it's also delivering oxygen into the lower levels of the photic zone in these northern latitudes. So there's a lot going on here. And basically, by interacting with one another, these warm and cold water currents are basically constantly regulating climate across the entire globe, even in regions that are terrestrial and not really associated with the water in any meaningful way. And so this is very important to note when we talk about interrupting thermohaline circulation as a result that could possibly trigger rapid climate change. So global warming is actually melting a substantial portion of Greenland's ice sheet. There was actually a photo that came out not too long ago where you had sled dogs actually wading through water that was about knee deep, and it was actually illustrating all of the snowmelt that used to be a glacier and was now basically had transitioned it into a wetland. Anyway, all of this water that is being sent into the ocean is basically interrupting that North Atlantic deep water current. Evidence suggests that if this snowmelt and this glacial melt continues to pour into the ocean, it can basically interrupt that North Atlantic deep water current altogether, and it might stop thermohaline circulation. Remember that thermohaline circulation delivers heat to parts of the globe which would otherwise not have it. If this system stops, it actually could trigger basically a resurgence of an enormous ice age. Now, scientists are debating how credible this threat actually might be, whether the weakening of the current, which we are actually observing right now, whether that weakening of the current will actually halt the entire current altogether, or whether this is just a temporary symptom of Greenland as Greenland continues to melt. But it is something worth noting, because if these deep water convection currents stop working, then we all of a sudden are going to get very rapid cooling. Basically, this has actually been called the day after tomorrow effect after the movie that came out not too long ago. And it could actually cause some seriously frigid temperatures in the polar regions of the planet. So now that we've talked about oceans and some of the ways that oceans regulate nutrients and climates, we're now going to go into marine and coastal ecosystems. Now, remember how I said that continental shelves have the highest biological diversity of any coastal ecosystem or any ecosystem within the ocean. And this is because there is a vast diversity of ecosystems along continental shelves that are going to be known broadly as marine and coastal ecosystems. They're very, very interesting in terms of their diversity, the diversity of different types of habitats, the biological diversity with the different species and different species ranges and regimes, and some of the different biological factors that are impacting them and working in impact, and some of the different biological factors at play. Now, so again, remember that the continental shelves are going to be the place within oceans that have the highest biological diversity. Again, that's going to be a question on your quiz, and it's also going to be a question on your exam. Now, moving forward, intertidal zones are the first habitat that we're going to talk about, specifically something called the rocky intertidal. Basically, this is an area between the uppermost reaches of high tides and then the lowest regions of low tides. And on the east coast, where there is a very rocky large number of rocky ecosystems, these are highly biologically diverse and productive habitats. Basically, the tide pools harbor diverse microecosystems, and the rocks offer a lot of structural complexity. Structural complexity, by the way, is going to be a theme for a lot of these ecosystems. The ability to provide a lot of highly complex nooks and crannies, little holes and crevices for things to go and hide in, produces an amazing habitat. It has an amazing ability to be foster very constant, very consistent engineered ecosystems, something that we talked about at length in earlier chapters. And so as a result, a lot of these structurally complex systems that we're going to talk about are going to have very high biological diversity. They're going to be great nursery habitats, and they're going to provide a lot of different ecosystem services. The rocky intertidal, although It's rocks that provide the structural complexity, not necessarily any biological organism. They are, for the same reasons or for similar reasons, also going to be very biologically productive habitats. The only major threat for intertidal ecosystems are basically coastal development, although even that is rare because rocky intertidal regions are very, very difficult to actually develop on because they are a little bit unstable and very difficult to actually do extensive development on. Now, moving forward, we are going to talk about estuaries. Estuaries are basically ecosystems that are formed when rivers or freshwater inputs meet the ocean. Basically, this is going to be an interchange and a mix of salt and fresh water. The main ecosystem service that estuaries provide are the fact that they are nursery habitats. Basically, there are a lot of marshes, salt marshes, which are something that we're going to talk about in just a second here, are going to be very structurally complex just because they have a lot of different marsh grasses that form a lot of nooks and crannies and are great for different organisms to hide in. They also are really great as far as controlling erosion, and they cycle a lot of nutrients. But perhaps their most vital ecosystem service, and this is going to be a running theme for a lot of these ecosystems, are the provision of nursery habitats for many commercial species. A lot of commercial fish species such as red drum, crabs, different types of shellfish, oysters, everything that we like to eat starts life in a lot of these different estuaries and a lot of these different other habitats. Without these habitats, we lose all of these commercial fish because if there isn't a place for them to grow up, they're not going to exist, and slowly they will die off entirely as the older individuals grow up and then die. The major threats associated with ecosystems that are estuaries are going to be water pollution, basically nutrient pollution causing blooms and severely killing off all of the grasses in estuaries, as well as habitat alteration and overfishing. So these are going to be some serious threats that have impacted ecosystem or estuary ecosystems in modern times. In the same vein, salt marshes are actually estuarine ecosystems which basically occur along temperate intertidal coastlines over gently sloping sandy sediments. So in direct contrast to the rocky intertidal that we had talked about earlier, in very sandy sediments that have intertidal regions, you're going to have a lot of salt marshes, which are basically just going to be areas where the tide very slowly comes up and comes down. You have a lot of really great sediment that is awesome for plant life, and as a result, you get a very different but also a biologically productive area. So some of the ecosystem services associated with salt marshes, it's a critical habitat for a lot of different shorebirds. It is also a nursery habitat for fish and particularly shellfish, and it does a fantastic job of controlling erosion, particularly for hurricanes and other major coastal storms. By literally holding down the ocean sediment, especially the coastal sediment, the different salt marshes do a fantastic job of holding everything down and keeping it from being washed away in the face of these major storms. In addition, they also filter pollution. Typically, the salt marshes, being very biologically productive plants, do a fantastic job of nitrogen cycling. Basically, they will absorb any nitrogen that is coming off the coast, so it keeps pollution or nutrient pollution from getting into the ocean in any significant capacity. A lot of the threats associated with salt marshes is that, unlike the rocky intertidal, they are very desirable to develop on, and so habitat loss through development is a major issue that is affecting these different salt marshes. So next we have our mangrove swamps. Mangrove swamps and mangrove forests are basically salt-tolerant habitats dominated by red and black mangroves along tropical intertidal coastal shorelines. Now, these are going to be in areas around South Florida, usually in Peninsula Florida, although we are actually, as a result of climate change, starting to see pioneer mangroves that are showing up even in the Gulf Coast and in the Panhandle, which is a little bit shocking. However, mangroves are pretty great. They're actually have these very complex root structures, which you can see on the right side of your screen. And basically what these are for is a complex strategy to get air to their oxygen, air and oxygen to their root systems. Basically, the water is very difficult for these roots to actually get air, and so in order to avoid suffocation, they have these elaborate branching structures as a way to increase the surface area of the roots and get oxygen into their roots. It's quite an elaborate evolutionary strategy. The byproduct of this is that they have that amazing structural complexity that we were just talking about, and they're a great habitat for nursery habitat for fish as well as invertebrates. In the same vein of salt marshes, they're also a great food source and foraging habitat for shorebirds, and they offer, similarly to salt marshes, and you'll see as a running theme for the coastal marine ecosystems, they do a great job of providing erosion control, again, by having that structural complexity, that hard surface for waves to break against. It keeps them from washing away the coastal environment. And they also, as a result of simply allowing water to slow down, they filter pollutants by letting the pollutants settle out of suspension and get sequestered into the sediment instead of being swept along with the water. They have some significant threats associated with them. The major one is coastal development. It is actually now illegal to get rid of or chop down any mangroves in Florida. Doing so will get a very hefty fine from FWC, and they do patrol mangrove swamps and mangrove forests pretty intensely to make sure that we are not chopping down any of these mangrove forests. In addition, shrimp and shellfish fishing, primarily bottom trolling, can rip up mangroves from the bottom, and that causes a significant amount of habitat loss and mortality for these trees as well. The next ecosystem that we're going to go over are what are called kelp forests. Recall that when we were talking about otters as keystone species, otters are actually the keystone species for the kelp forests. These are a coastal ecosystem dominated by kelp, which is a very large macroalgae that can grow in tall, dense strands. Sometimes kelp ecosystems or kelp forests can grow up to hundreds of feet. Now, they do a lot of the same ecosystem services that we see for a lot of these coastal habitats. They're a habitat for many coastal fish species. They absorb a lot of wave energy, so they reduce erosion. And they also serve, because kelp is very interesting as a macroalgae, serve as cosmetics, different food sources, as well as paints. Now, the threats to these kelp forests is habitat loss, specifically kelp die-offs. When we remove otters and different sorts of lobsters from a kelp ecosystem, sea urchins, which like to eat kelp, will grow unchecked, and they can actually wipe out entire kelp forests. In addition to this, heat stress as a result of global warming is taking a serious toll on kelp forests, and it's beginning to kill them off as well. In addition, in a lesser capacity, pollution can also damage kelp forests, although this isn't nearly as problematic as the other two sources of habitat loss. Moving down now, two of the ecosystems that I really think are important as a Floridian and someone who has studied these ecosystems extensively are seagrass meadows and oyster reefs. These are not actually talked about in your book, but this is something that I felt was incredibly important as a marine and coastal ecosystem, particularly in Florida, where these two ecosystems are so incredibly important. And so these are some things that I'm also going to test you on, both in your quiz as well as your exam. Basically, seagrass meadows are coastal ecosystems dominated by dense flowering plants, and they live and grow entirely underwater. They are one of the most, so we talked a lot about different nursery habitats for the other coastal ecosystems. Seagrass meadows are one of the most vital nursery habitats for more than 80% of commercial fish species. They are incredibly vital as a nursery habitat. They also, similar to some of the other complex coastal ecosystems, they absorb wave energy and they also reduce erosion. In addition to this, seagrass meadows, because they are so biologically productive, are one of the most enormous carbon sinks on the planet. Basically, they absorb carbon from the ocean and they basically sequester it into their below ground biomass and sequester that carbon or store that carbon in the ground so it doesn't contribute to climate change. There are a number of threats associated with seagrass meadows. The first is going to be propeller scars. Basically, when people drag their propeller when they're starting up their boat through seagrass meadows, it can really damage seagrass meadows almost as a form of microhabitat fragmentation. Then heat stress from global warming is really beginning to wreak havoc on seagrass meadows. They can't really tolerate some of the higher ocean temperatures that we're beginning to see as a result of global warming. And then finally, algal blooms from eutrophication, which we are seeing all over the place, particularly in places like Tampa. Although Tampa has done a fantastic job of reducing their nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, algal blooms from eutrophication block out sunlight, and because seagrasses require a huge amount of sunlight in order to photosynthesize, this can be a significant problem as well. The next coastal ecosystem that your book doesn't talk about that I felt was very important are oyster reefs. Oyster reefs refer to dense aggregations of oysters that form large colonial communities, and they create an incredibly important habitat for hundreds of other marine species. Again, they're a very complex environment. They also filter and clean water. Oysters can filter like 2 gallons of water an hour, which is insane, and they do just a fantastic job of filtering pollutants as well as filtering for different nitrogen, phosphorus, and different microorganisms. In addition, oysters being a very hard structure can really help with erosion control, and in addition, oysters are a huge food source within Florida as well as North America as a whole. It's very interesting then that a lot of people don't know that oysters are in basically in a global crisis. We have lost, and I'm not kidding here, 80 to 90% of the oysters globally. A lot of this is due to overharvesting, something that we talked about in the chapter 8, sources of biodiversity loss. They're also dying off due to nutrient pollution and as well as shoreline development. Basically, when we take away habitat that was typically utilized by oysters, we then lose the ability of oysters to continue to function and perform their duties, and it basically accelerates the loss of oyster reefs elsewhere. So this can be a serious problem. But the fact that 90% of our oysters are already gone is something that a lot of people don't readily realize, and it's something that we should definitely be paying attention to, because I don't know about you, but I love eating oysters, and I would go crazy if I didn't have Hunt's Oyster Bar over in St. Andrews to go and chow down at here from time to time. So perhaps the most notorious coastal ecosystem that everyone knows and everyone knows is in trouble are coral reefs. Coral reefs are one of the most elaborate and biologically productive ecosystems in the world, and they are formed from masses of complex calcium carbonate shells of tiny organisms or tiny animals called coral. Basically, they are enormous colonies of these individual animals. They're not plants. They are animals called coral polyps. Polyps are in the same family as jellyfish. If you can think of a jellyfish as having their tentacles on the bottom and they float around, polyps are the exact opposite. They have their tentacles on the top, and instead of having that floating, bobbing top that jellyfish have, they have an anchoring point where they're anchored themselves into the ground. So where jellyfish look like this, corals are upside down. Anyway, new polyps will build their shells on top of old polyps, and so they constantly are growing outward. And it's really interesting because they, over millions of years, they create these highly elaborate branching calcium carbonate structures called coral reefs that are just incredibly biologically productive and home for millions of fish around the world. Now, they survive actually off of predation. One of the coolest parts of my job when I was working in Little Cayman for coral reef restoration was actually getting to do a little bit of coral feeding whenever we were doing night dives. They eat small organisms that get too close. In particular, there are a bunch of different worms known as bloodworms that are swimming around at night, and they're attracted to light. And so what we would do is we'd take a flashlight and we would shine it on the coral to attract the worms to the coral. The coral would be sitting out like this, and the moment a worm got too close, the coral would snag it, bring it in, and then break it to pieces. It was so cool to get to see. So they actually thrive off of predation, and in addition, they have this mutualistic, remember, a mutualism is a species interaction that we learned in chapter 4, where both organisms benefit. They have a mutualistic interaction with an algae called zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae live in the soft tissues of the coral polyps, and in exchange for having a home and access to nutrients, the zooxanthellae actually photosynthesize within coral polyps, and as a result, they provide a supplementary food source in the form of sugar. So it's a really interesting mutualism between these two organisms. The ecosystem services that coral reefs provide are just absolutely immense. There is a myriad of different services that they provide. First and foremost, they're a habitat for many commercial fish, similar to other coastal ecosystems that we talked about. They are among the most biologically productive systems in the world. They are incredibly beautiful to look at, dive in, and go exploring in. And so as a result, they're a very popular ecotourism destination. So they fund millions of dollars in ecotourism, and they do a fantastic job of controlling erosion in the areas where they're present. keeping all of this in mind, it's very sad that we are actually losing a huge number of our coral reefs. Coral reefs are worldwide in a serious catastrophe. They are declining rapidly as a result of warming water from climate change. The warmer water, pollution, and eutrophication causes what is called coral bleaching. Basically, that mutualistic interaction between coral and zooxanthellae, that algae organism that we were just talking about. When corals become too stressed out as a result of current conditions, what they will do is they will actually expel their algae from their tissues. And this is what is called coral bleaching. Basically, the zooxanthellae is what is giving coral all of their color. So when the corals bleach, or when they expel all of that algae from their tissues, they go from that very colorful coral that we all know and really like to look at to these very white, dead-looking structures. Basically, they look like skeletons of their former selves. Usually, once a coral bleaches, it can't reacquire that zooxanthellae, so it can't get the algae back, and they die shortly afterward because that mutualism is so vital to that coral polyp's health. Pollution is another serious issue associated with coral bleaching. Basically, the nutrient promotion promotes algal growth. And if you look even in Little Cayman, where I was working, you could see this battle between the algae that was blooming rapidly along the coral reefs and the corals literally trying to fight them off. And it was very apparent that even in very pristine ecosystems like Little Cayman, these coral reefs were losing the battle to algae, as algae was simply able to outgrow and grow on top of the coral, using their structures as a way to latch onto things, very similar to how they would do to rocks, and it will actually smother corals and kill them. The final threat to corals are ocean acidification. Remember that was global warming's twin brother. When we emit CO2 into the atmosphere, a lot of CO2 is actually absorbed back into the water. When it is absorbed into the water, what happens is that CO2 reacts with water to form carbonic acid. When it forms carbonic acid reduces the calcium carbonate ions, so carbonate ions in the water. When carbonate ions are no longer available to organisms, a lot of organisms such as crabs, coral reefs, any calcium carbonate shell-building organism gets stressed out and can't actually pull carbonate ions out of the water. They can't grow their shells, and they actually die as a result. If ocean acidification, basically if the water becomes too acidic over time within the next 40 years, it will actually kill off millions of organisms that need those calcium carbonate shells as a way to sustain themselves and protect themselves. So this not only harms corals, but it harms blue crabs, it harms any shell-building organisms, so nautiluses and cuttlefish, and just about any other organism such as bivalves or any shell-building organism that uses calcium carbonate as a way to build a shell to protect themselves. So that is everything that we have for the ocean ecosystems. I hope you enjoyed it. I really love these ecosystems. I love getting to talk about them. I think they're so interesting. If you're not dive certified, on a complete tangent, get dive certified and go visit some of these ecosystems. Coral is likely going to be completely killed off. It's one of the saddest stories in marine biology. We don't even really, we're trying to save them as quickly as we can, but even in Little Cayman, it was a losing battle. Fly, go get dive certified and visit these places before it's too late. It is so beautiful and so amazing to go and look at them, and it's an absolute tragedy that we're probably going to lose them by like 2040 or 2050, so easily within our lifetimes. Go visit these places before it's too late. They're so beautiful, and I cannot recommend them enough. So next, now that we've talked about ocean ecosystems as well as freshwater ecosystems, we're going to be going over some of the problems. So we're going to go over water uses, water pollution, and then overfishing in the next 3 lectures for this chapter. All right, I'll see you next time.